Good afternoon. My name is Jason Howard, and I'm presenting on Finitude is the Lingua Cosmica of the moral universe. I think just the possibility alone of extraterrestrial life does raise questions about the source, that is, the ground and inclusiveness of our moral categories. There has been a lot of interesting work in this issue already, a variety of anthologies, articles, monographs developed around a lot of these issues, especially here just in the last decade. One crucial enabling constraint that I want to bring to your attention this morning, and I feel hasn't really gotten the full recognition it deserves, is the issue of shared mortality. And by shared mortality, I mean the fact that beings are born and die under a similar time span, and also finitude. And finitude, I take to be the recognition of one's mortality. My argument here is that any attempt to comprehend whether we could have moral obligations to extraterrestrials, both what kind of extraterrestrials and what types of commitment, will be incomplete uh, unless we take into consideration the shared constraint of mortality. So, in general, this is going to mean that one of the important implications here, once we recognize mortality finitude, is that the more similar and recognizable the shared constraint of mortality, I think the more concrete our moral relationships and obligations are going to be. Thus, those alien races who fall within a similar time constraint, similar time horizon as us, will be in our peer group, here to borrow a term employed by Ted Peters, while those that fall outside of this time horizon will not be part of our peer group. I think there are a variety of important implications once we recognize mortality finitude that'll spell out as the presentation goes on. One of them is the fact we won't be able to have more relationships to AI, whether those are extraterrestrial or we create them ourselves, or alien microbes or planets as a single entity, and I'll spell out why I believe this to be the case later on. And then finally, my conclusion there is that in terms of future prospects, human beings will likely never develop moral relationships or obligations to any beings not indigenous to planet Earth. Now, the recognition of finitude isn't new. Stoicism explicitly recognizes it, and the traditional ethical theories do not deny the fact of mortality. They all presuppose it, I think, to varying degrees. But I do believe that the concrete moral significance, let's say the indispensability of mortality and finitude, hasn't really been sufficiently explored. And there's a variety, I think, of reasons for this. Some of them very complicated, but here I think the most likely reason is just the fact that our most pressing moral commitments and obligations are to beings like ourselves, fellow human beings, or other non-human animals that share a similar time span to us. So in this sense, the horizon of moral engagement measured in days, weeks, years, decades, forms the umbrella under which our most robust commitments emerge and disappear. And this is, I think, partly why the issue of mortality and finitude hasn't received sufficient recognition. But of course, once we consider if we have obligations to life forms beyond Earth, the question of the lifespan of these different entities becomes explicit. And I think along with that, our own the significance of mortality and finitude as indispensable conditions for morality in general, I think also become explicit in a way that had been easy to miss. So here I just want to kind of note, kind of break down, as it were, build up a little bit this case of mortality and finitude, why it's important. I think there's three schools, three branches of philosophy here that really offer the most resources. One of them is existentialism phenomenology, another ethics of care, another ethics of recognition. Here I'm thinking people like Hegel, Axel Honneth, and Charles Taylor. I think these three approaches really bring into relief the positive and indispensable role of embodiment in grounding moral agency. They do this in different ways, but by focusing on embodiment, they all highlight the significance of intersubjectivity, historicity, the perspicacity of emotions, and finitude. So what I want to do now is just, again, highlight some of the important claims, I think, that relate to mortality and finitude in terms of morality. I think it's because we are mortal and we can reflect on this fact that the possible can become a category, a defining category of human existence. I mean, there are many ways that we can relate to the fact of our own existence. And because we can relate to this, it means that we can participate to a certain extent in our own development, and we can participate in the development of other human beings as well. This ability to participate in who we are, I think, makes possible both meaning and morality in the widest possible sense. To drill down a little more here, I think it's our shared vulnerability and fragility that even makes caring possible. If you think about accountability or responsibility, or even every other meaningful commitment, these would lose their force, I think, and their incentive without invulnerability, without some sense in which our actions do make a difference in one way or another. From that, I mean, I think we necessarily prioritize our commitments. We have a variety of relations and obligations. These require support, some degree of cultivation. These decisions and commitments can't be postponed indefinitely. Often there's no guarantee that they'll be successful, and we often need to limit the kinds of relationships that we take on. Here, I think a Nodding's distinction between caring for and caring about is very useful. I think we can care about all kinds of things, but we certainly can't care for, because this is a much more engaged, much more time-consuming relationship where we're directly involved with other human beings, and we, like them, can be transformed and changed throughout the relationship. And then finally, I think many of our moral attitudes and moral emotions of self-assessment here, like guilt, shame, remorse, pride, do presuppose a common temporal horizon that's fine-tuned, as it were, between past, present, and future. We have attitudes and our emotional life, which presuppose a deep attunement and sensitivity to the exigency of temporal becoming. This capacity to access the past, expectations, hopes for the future. This means our moral identity is thick with commitments and connections, many imposed by the temporal historical character of our own existence. And so, in short, then, morality really only matters in a world where actions and beliefs can make an actual difference in some entity's life. And I do think that our efforts and actions can make a difference. They have made a difference, and they will make a difference. And without this horizon of recognition, the moral domain just doesn't have any anchor. And moral responsibility becomes here largely indistinguishable from platitudes and lip service. So there have been numerous calls to move beyond anthropocentric thinking when considering our moral obligations to extraterrestrials. And I just want to address this issue specifically in line with this notion of mortality and finitude. First, I want to recognize that certainly in the existentialist tradition, I think finitude is often understood in a very restrictive or exclusive sense. As a source of kind of radical individuation, alienation. Human beings here look out in an absurd universe, an indifferent universe, where the only solace is some kind of leap of some sort. We see this in Pascal, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, many existentialists. I'm quite opposed to this position. I think finitude is really a bridge. It helps expand the moral universe. It's finitude that allows us, again, to participate in our own identity, to have some measure of participation in the identity of other beings. It is what makes the possible defining category of existence. So in this sense, finitude is really a bridge to moral relationships rather than some kind of radical source of individuation. Similarly, finitude is part of our evolutionary adaptation. It grounds us in nature and connects us with the natural histories of life on this planet. So in this sense, it's a very robust moral anchor. Similarly, I think, finitude is not a simple trait or a template. It's not that we can only care for beings who live within the same time frame or lifetime as Homo sapiens. I mean, if you just think about it, to be finite is to live in an open future, not a closed one. We don't know when people will die. So in this sense, the future is open, but nevertheless, our engagements need to take place within a horizon of significance where efforts can be recognized, where reciprocity is at least possible, where actions have a chance of making some difference. If not here in our own generation, then at least in future generations of mortal beings. Moreover, although finitude here, that is the awareness of one's mortality, I think is a condition of moral agency. Moral obligations are not confined to beings who can reflect on their own mortality. So here, to use some of the typical terminology of ethics, morality is a condition for being, mortality, I should say, is a condition for being a moral patient, that is, for being the subject of moral consideration, but not all moral patients need to be moral agents. What mortality does, I think, is just constrain the span of meaningful interventions and consequences. I think we are aware of an entity's lifespan, and this does provide the overarching context from which we care and nurture them. Even if this fact isn't often explicit, that doesn't mean it isn't operative. Now, when we turn to astroethics, I think certainly the fact of mortality is implied by many positions. But I think the multiple negative implications here haven't always been as explored, I think, to the extent that they should be. So in one sense, I mean, anyone who presupposes, life as a process of natural selection is going to suppose mortality as some kind of constraint. Of the various positions that I outline, and this is not meant to be at all exhaustive, it's just a quick summary of some leading positions. I think David Dunner in the notion of interstellar intersubjectivity comes closest to naming the significance here of finitude in his notion of a shared attention spans. But here what I want to just highlight is that sentience, rationality, I mean, the development of complexity, all of these things can be understood without mortality, finitude. And in that sense, I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of these positions have overlooked just how restrictive mortality and finitude are. Certainly from the situation of AI, I mean, AI, easily dispatches with issues of embodiment and finitude, but yet can make sense of rationality and complexity. So similarly, in the Christian moral theological tradition, rationality, moral complexity, sentience, I mean, none of these things have proven incompatible with immortality. So in that sense, these ideas are separable as categories from mortality and finitude. What this leaves us with then, I mean, once we, I think, unpack, I mean, all of the implications is that, first of all, mortality, that is a being's lifespan, and finitude, the awareness of these limits, would play crucial roles in determining whether we can have meaningful moral relationships or not to extraterrestrial beings. I think here, if we ever discover life beyond Earth, our chance to build a moral relationship with these beings ultimately will not rest primarily on whether they look like us, share similar DNA, reason like us, have similar cosmic aspirations, or even sense pleasure and pain, but whether they experience similar constraints on their lifespan and actions. And here this means that even beings who, let's say, are mortal but live for thousands of years are still going to find it impossible to understand the concerns and cares of beings who live, I think, a sliver of that time. There's just too much difference in how we assess risk, promise keeping, issues of emotional sensitivity, and other categories of commitment that just will have too much of a disconnect from moving from, decades and a century at most to thousands of years. And then finally, beings who can, thanks to some kind of technological advancement, slip the constraints of mortality completely. So here I'm thinking AI or downloading consciousness, something like that, won't be able to have any more relationships at all. And this is something I think is often misunderstood by people working on a lot of these related problems with AI and cybernetic beings. I think meaning and agency will be replaced by information and computation. So all the most informative moral attitudes and emotions would simply lose their traction. And here, I think the ability to die is simply the price we pay to experience a meaningful and moral life. And without such a constraint, we'd become unrecognizable. So context, ambiguity, chance, uncertainty, death, without concrete limits like this to our existence, we could never feel a personal stake in anything. And in this sense, obligations, notions like this, urgency, vulnerability, they simply wouldn't have any real register. And so AI would not be able to have moral relationships at all. So where does this leave us here to conclude? Well, I think we're going to live in a bounded moral horizon in the end. In terms of finding other finite beings like ourselves, here I think it's likely the higher order intelligence is extremely rare in the universe. So in that sense, it's doubtful we'll ever have moral obligations to extraterrestrial intelligence. This is similar to the position Adam Potthast takes most recently. But I would like to kind of, add a little bit more and say that if we ever do encounter intelligent ET, which is possible here, given the constraints of things like the speed of light, harsh conditions of interstellar travel, these beings will be some form of AI. And I think this seems to be the consensus in the astrobiology community as well. But then they will be incapable of having moral relationships with us. So I think the most likely scenario here is that we'll discover microbial life, and we can certainly have indirect or derived moral obligations to these beings. Again, we can care about them, but we won't really be able to care for them directly. And this is somewhat similar to positions outlined by Adam Potthast, and I think Kelly Smith comes to a somewhat similar position, although again, my reasons here are different in emphasizing mortality and finitude. That's not to say this discovery wouldn't be important. Of course, it would be. It would stretch paradigms. But in terms of our moral commitments to these beings, there would still be a more abstract identification than anything else. And again, we could care about them, but we're not going to be caring for them. In a sense, the richest moral relationships are those of mutual recognition. These stretch, challenge, and nurture our capacities for moral agency to the widest extent possible. And the condition for that isn't being human, as it were. It's simply sharing a similar time horizon and being able to engage and interact and participate in those time horizons. And consequently, then, I think it's likely the only moral relationships human beings will ever have is to other mortal creatures on planet Earth. And here are my sources. And I do appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.